Namaste. So, if at some point you can't hear me, too bad.
Need a personal mic.
Well, we might have to go to that. But we could secrete it. So one of the things about being in a new space is you have to figure out what works and what doesn't, and change what doesn't. And so that'll be the next few weeks. But I wanted to talk today about, well, I've always wondered, people that made up the lectionary, why didn't they separate this great commandment from the Good Samaritan? Because while it goes with it, they're also both really important, and you can't really do both justice on the same day. And I decided that since when we last were together 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about who the Samaritans were, that they were the half-breeds who were considered unclean because they were part Jewish and part Gentile. They had intermarried with the locals, gone out with that girl from the other side of the tracks, and worse than that, they knocked her out. And now their offspring are the Samaritans. And so traditionally you look at that Good Samaritan story and you see that the message is all the observant Jewish folks in the story, even the priests and the Levite, who were the experts in the religious law, just walked past. They were too busy. And a couple of years ago they did a study at a seminary where they assigned the Good Samaritan story to the students so they could prepare a sermon on that topic. And then as they were headed to class to give their sermon, they put somebody along the way who pretended that he had been hurt. And the students who had to give their sermon that day were too busy to stop, even though they were going to talk about the very situation they were encountering. They were too busy to stop. And if it wasn't their day to give their talk, they were more likely to stop. Which goes to show you, even if you have something in the front of your mind, it's what's going on behind that that drives what you're doing. It's the sense of urgency that we all choose, the priorities we all establish. And those priorities will override whatever we think our values are. And so you get to, I thought it was important, if you don't want to start saying, well, what Jesus meant when he said, who is my neighbor, is who lives to my north and who lives to my south, or if your house faces the other way, my east and my west. And what Jesus didn't mean, or what Jesus meant was not, my neighbors are the people who look like me, live close to me, have the kind of job that I do, or pretty close to it, went to the same schools that I did, and don't challenge my preconceived notions at all. Buddhism, on the other hand, says nothing exists in a vacuum. It doesn't say it that way, but that's what they mean. There's always a number of factors that come together to make everything and everybody happy. So I'm not picking on anyone, but an excellent example is Kimberlyn trying to get here today. What are the causes and conditions? Well, you can look at the fact that she didn't go out and drill for the oil and refine it into gasoline that she poured into her car. Nor did she open the service station and sell it to herself. But on a more even fundamental level, traveling from one place to the next Our ability to be on time is dependent on traffic, which is dependent on what's going on. There's an afternoon Brewers game, and people are gluttons for punishment and want to watch the Cardinals whip up on the Brewers again. Traffic will go up. If it's the last day of Summerfest and you get in free from noon until 3, traffic will go up.
And there was a guy on the side of the road that was trying to his damnedest to walk in a straight line, but he couldn't seem to follow the cop's directions.
Oh.
And I was like, he's just standing there with his feet in front of the other, and the cop's like, he's just standing there going,
X.
he wasn't moving though, he wasn't swaying. He was afraid if he picked up his foot.
Yes.
So,
So drunk's on the road.
drugs on the road.
But the drunk didn't get on the road all by himself.
No, he had a bunch of alcohol that was not produced by him.
Yeah. Somebody gave him the alcohol that wasn't produced by him. Somebody produced the alcohol. Somebody drove it to the store where he bought it, or to the bar where he bought it. Somebody worked at the store or the bar. And so, if you just spend a little time looking at even the simplest thing we do, it's not just that we decide to do it, we make it happen, and we didn't need anybody else to help. So you start to see that not only is everything interconnected, but a bunch of things are responsible for anything that happens. And so, because everything's connected, everything that happens has impact on more than one person. It has to. From something as simple as, I always get nervous when I'm down at Summerfest and I see people who have had a few too many standing on those rocks along the water. Because I'm sure somebody every year either falls into the water or gashes himself open on the rock. It's just, it's bound to happen. And somebody has to respond. Somebody has to either fish them out or bandage them up, take them away. And if we say we're not going to do that, if we say we're not going to work together, if we say, so sorry that Fred fell in the water, but that's Fred's problem and not mine, then it doesn't affect only Fred. Because we become more and more callous, more and more indifferent. And the way we act towards other people changes. And they don't like us very much anymore. And so, there's this curious problem. Because the answer to the who's my neighbor question has to be everybody. Because we cannot separate any person, any one person, from everybody else. It can't be done. Even a newborn baby just popped out and got slapped because two people did something. Even if one of them was a doctor with a test tube and a turkey baster. And so, why, when there's a problem, do we look for one person or event that's responsible? It's not possible. That's what interconnectedness means. It can't be just one person. It has to be what Buddhists call sufficient causes and conditions. That's why some people get lung cancer from smoking and others don't. Because smoking in and of itself does not represent a sufficient cause and condition for lung cancer. If it did, everybody who smoked would get lung cancer. And so, especially as we get more and more complicated technically, and more complicated with our technology, we have to bring our thinking along with it. Why did people, depending on where you draw the line between a few and several, somewhere between a few and several people decide that it was time to get a couple sniper positions and start shooting people in Dallas? Well, the news is only too happy to try and give you one reason. But here's an excellent example of this principle. Your average person on the street does not have the skills or the equipment necessary to go to the top of a building and start shooting people efficiently. We just don't, unless we have military training. And I read an article that suggested that the shooter, never saw combat in Afghanistan, so that couldn't possibly have, been an issue. That's just stupid. And we can go on and on from there. And yet, we seem much more concerned about blaming than changing a situation. Because responsibility never gets you to causes and conditions. Responsibility says, this guy did it, or she did it over there, and never looks at all the contributing factors. And so that's where this neighbor concept comes in. If I treat my neighbor like dirt, what I'm really doing, quite possibly to myself, and certainly to someone, is starting to create the causes and conditions for them to act in a way that's destructive either toward themselves or somebody else. So ultimately, who's my neighbor? I am. And every one of us are. And there's no separating that, as much as we want to separate it. And I'm not saying that if I go out and do something that's wrong, I'm not responsible for it. I certainly am. But it also not just going to affect me, and I didn't just wake up this morning for no reason, unless I'm severely mentally ill, and decide to do it without prior combinations of causes and conditions. So the point of it all is really simple. We like to separate the Great Commandment into two things. Love God with all your heart and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the truth is, that's one thing. Because just like you can't separate people from one another into independent, autonomous, functioning entities, you can't separate God from men. Because we are inseparably linked. The creation myths tell us that on the first day, God didn't create Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards so that God could wrestle together the stuff required to create. The creation comes out of whatever it is to be God. And so it's an artificial separation to say God's up there, God's out there. It was appropriate for a time in our history. But we need to recognize that God's here and God's dwelling in everybody. And so, because on top of that, we are connected inseparably with each other. There is no way out. There is no way that maligning another, hurting another, cheating another hurts anybody more than it hurts ourselves. Amen.